All right, I think we're on. Good morning to everybody who is in our Far West region and everybody else. Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Mossbrook. I am chair of our Virtual Connections Committee in Farm. I'm also a member of the Folk Alliance International Board. And I am here right now just to welcome everybody and to introduce our panel. Our panel today on Tech Tuesday is called Telling Your Story, and we will get deeper into what that means. We are joined by a panel including Jill Kettles, Jamie Stone, Dom Flemons, and our moderator, Vania Kennard. Vania is on our farm board. She is a new member of the board, and she serves as a consultant helping artists to develop their brand and image and other productions or other things. And she is a co-collaborator in everything with her husband, Dom Flemons, who is also on our panel. Anyway, with that, Vania Kennard, welcome.
Hey, Charlie, thanks so much for having me, and so glad you all could join us for this really wonderful virtual connection. And as Charlie said, I'm Vania Kennard, and I'm currently working as a consultant with different artists and helping them develop their special projects. But a little bit about me, just to tell you my story. I grew up in a military family, so we traveled around the world a lot. And eventually I went to college and studied politics, of all exciting subjects, and had a career in politics for almost a decade before I met Dom in Washington, D.C. And once we met, he was like, hey, do you want to help me develop the American Songster brand? And that was a couple of years after he had left the Carolina Chocolate Drop. So from that moment on, we've been working together on amazing projects, and I've been helping him develop his story with the American Songster brand, as well as uncovering his own family story and mine as well, which has really deep roots in Texas and Mississippi and North Carolina and Virginia, as well as out west. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and I have a lot of really great questions for the entire panel. So we're going to get to everyone individually, but I just wanted to, kick off the conversation with a question that I had in mind, which is, how has your story evolved, beginning with when you started playing music or started in the music industry to where it is currently today? And so, Dom, if you wanted to start with just giving folks a little bit about your background, and then you could tell people why you started the American Songster brand and how has it evolved today. And then we'll move right on over to Jamie Stone, who will introduce himself as well.
All right. Well, my name's Dom Flemons, and over the years, I've taken on the moniker of the American Songster, and I started into playing music back in the later part of the '90s, and I got interested in folk music. And out in Arizona, where I'm from, I found that there was a folk music community that was out there, but I found that a lot of the older music that I was finding in especially in the library and in some of the antique shops and the record stores I went to, I found it wasn't being played so much. And so I started to learn these old time styles of music and begin to present them on stage. And while also learning songs, I began to also learn a lot of these wonderful instruments. At first it was the guitar and the harmonica, then it was the banjo, and then I, over time, began to start playing the jug and the quills and the rhythm bones. And that led me to just start presenting music that was multifaceted, not just as literature, but also as a demonstration of different regional styles and at times of ideologies and the ways that people lived and talked about their folk music. And so that's how it started. And over time, I found that since I had an interest in more than just one type of folk music, I wanted to develop a brand that would explain to people that music isn't necessarily relegated to singular genres, but it's a widespread love and very much it's a very open conversation of region and style. And so that's kind of the basic gist of the American Songster.
Awesome. Jamie Stone, it would be great if you could talk a little bit about your background and tell us about your story, whether it's your family connection or regional story that you brought into your work as a musician.
Hmm. Well, I grew up in Toronto, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the world. A city of, they call it a city of neighborhoods. So, there's the Korean neighborhood and Indian neighborhood and Portuguese and Italian. It's just like everywhere you go in the city, there's all these very distinct uh, styles of food and music and culture that's very visible and really celebrated. And in particular, there was a venue called Harborfront that was right along the water, and they had a festival of a different world culture every weekend, all summer long, for 3 months. And so I got to see people like Ali Farka Touré and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and Boubacar Traoré and just incredible musicians from all over. And that interspersed with the neighborhoods that I was finding myself in, it just felt completely natural to be involved and excited by all of these different musical cultures. And then when I started playing music, I naturally had my ears perked to all kinds of things. And when I got into folk music like Dom, I became really fascinated with the stories behind the music. Regional styles. I remember actually when I first started playing banjo when I was 16, digital music was not a thing yet, and they couldn't press all the music that a record label would have. And so I remember sending a postcard to Smithsonian Folkways. Back in the day, you could request that they basically spin up an individual copy. You'd get it in this very janky little box, and they would mimeograph all the liner notes, but more than the usual liner notes of a record, pages and pages of information, about Elizabeth Cotten and Mississippi John Hurt and all these incredible musicians. And I just became fascinated and was, very nerdy at that time, still am. And every time anyone would get mentioned, I would go, oh, well, I should listen to the people that influence them and influence them. And so I started kind of tracing this wide family tree. But I brought that same kind of sensibility when I started listening to West African music and meeting kora players, and was also really into pop music and jazz and all kinds of stuff. And so I really kind of fell into, because I specifically didn't play music from the place that I grew up or my cultural heritage, my, kind of brand, as it were, became not at all about me, but one journalist once called me a musical evangelist. It was always like, hey, everybody, look at this and look at this. And inadvertently, just naturally, every record I made became kind of a deep exploration of a particular style of music or a particular lens through which we could look at music from all over the world. So I made a record of folk dances, and I made a record with a chamber symphony, and I made a couple records of based on Alan Lomax's field recordings, and a record after traveling in West Africa. And so they became very thematic, and I just became more and more tuned to the way in which the framing, building a frame around music that had kind of deeper cultural, historical, aesthetic reference points was really important to me, and something that I later, as I started coaching other artists and mentoring other artists, became, and producing records, just became a way of starting to just see and elevate those aspects of people's work, which we can talk more about.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love the breakdown of the different influences that you've been able to bring into your life when it comes to the different albums and regions that you really appreciate. So yes, let's definitely talk more about that. And I want to jump over to Jill Kettles over here. She's actually the conference director over at SURFA. And she does a lot with publicity and PR and social media and a little bit of everything. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about your story and background and how you were able to get started in this industry and some of the ways that you've seen it evolve when it comes to people telling their stories and creating their brands.
Well, I started in 1994, and I had my big break working with Mark Pucci in 1996. I started off working with him, and I worked with him for 18 years. And about 10 years ago, I went on my own, and I have a firm called Miss Jill PR. And then I found myself on the Folk Alliance board, and then they elected me president. And who knows? We have to pick our officers next month, so we'll see what if I keep the chair or not. Um, I started when you had to call people. I started when you had to, yeah, mail the pieces of paper, mail the 8x10s and ship it off. I come from, calling people and talking to them about the artist, telling their story, and also communicating with the journalists and the writers and the editors, their story and my story and how you get started. So I basically got started by default. I have a painting background. I'm a printmaker. I am a photographer, and I use all my artistic background to apply it to the music as well as the words to present a nice little picture. I worked with everybody, and the list goes on and on. But basically, I present myself as a liaison between the artists and the publications and the media and their audience. And now you have to really hone in on your story. You almost have to have a 50 word, a 100 word, a 300 word, and you really got to be able to talk pretty fast. And I think it's just consistency is the best. And if you can keep it simple, like a billboard when you're driving down the road, you're great.
That's great. And actually, I have a follow-up question to you just to sort of kick the conversation into a new direction. What have you seen in your work experience that has been very relatable to the audience that an artist has been able to put out there when it comes to their story? Do you find that artists tend to lean more on personal situations that have happened in their life, or they sort of bring together new stories, conceptual stories that the audience finds very interesting?
Well, I worked with a guy who had a stroke in the middle of his album. He was recording it, and his name is Angie Aparo, and he had a stroke in the middle, and that was the lead story. And he had in the middle of all of that, and he learned from Surrey. He learned from talking to Surrey. He learned going up and down the grocery store, and that was the story. His music is brilliant. He's a brilliant songwriter. Don't get me wrong. He's written songs for so many good, big, huge people. However, the story was the stroke, and that was the lead pitch. And we had great success, but the best success I did was I took his message and his story to the National Stroke Association, and National Stroke Association put him on the front cover of their glossy magazine in February of 2016, 17. And he got more coverage on that than he probably would have been if he was in no depression. And then I've also had people who do stories, and they tell a story of like the land or their background, their hometown. Because Tim O'Brien did a great album of like West Virginia artists, and he included everybody, from country to blues to R&B, and did his own versions. And then I had a guy I worked with, Tom Russell. He had a brilliant album called "Man from God Knows Where," and he traced his ancestral roots back to Ireland and found out he was the guy.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. So really, it's whatever, the artist wants to, whatever direction the artist wants to go in. And you as someone working in the PR realm, it's your job to make sure that that story gets placed with the correct outlets that really match the intention of the story. And that brings me to a topic which was very relatable to us with Dom. He released Black Cowboys on Smithsonian Folkways, and part of the story was his family's background being in the Southwest, but we wanted to bring to life this bigger concept of African American cowboys in general, and the Great Migration that took place many generations ago. So what we did was we created the story, which was actually in the form of a liner notes booklet, which we can talk a little bit more. And Jamie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on liner notes too. But essentially, we did a 40-page booklet, and it had visuals. So it wasn't just, all the historical content, but it was actual photos and tintypes. And we took that story and we pitched it to all the different types of Western museums you could think of. And honestly, to this day, that story has never ended. Like, we're still seeing that being very relevant. So I think one piece of advice I would have to folks on the live stream right now is, when you think about your story, think about how it relates to you now, but also the impact of it as the next generation comes by and listens to your music too, because they can breathe new life into your story, even when you feel like you've said all that you needed to say. And I'm sure Dom can kind of chime in a little bit more about that.
Yeah, because one thing is, Vania came in after the first, the initial parts of the project, because I had been working on it for a while, but kind of connecting and dovetailing off of what Jill was talking about. In 2016, I played at the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So I was a part of that program in Washington, D.C. And I was aware of the African American Legacy series that was a part of Smithsonian Folkways that was connected to that museum. And at that time, they had not had a contemporary artist put an album out. Everything had been legacy up to that point. And so when I was coming up with the concept for Black Cowboys, it dawned on me that I should reach out to Smithsonian Folkways and try to make it a part of the African American Legacy series, because at that time, the museum didn't have any iconography or any information about Black cowboys specifically. And so I knew that eventually, third, fourth round, or at least how I conceptually thought about third or fourth round, it actually happened a lot quicker once the album came out. I figured that that would be a proper place to go, because if you put the Black Cowboy CD into the gift shop, at least you now have a tangible product that has music connected to it that could showcase both the history of Black cowboys, confirming that the history is there and that it's relevant, but also having a musical component so that people could also see the relevance of African American folk songs in the context of Black cowboys. So there was a lot of, in the way that I put together, I tried to be very conscious of creating a multifaceted product that would project a lot of things from the museum itself. And that's something that, I mean, it's been amazing to see how it's still holding true even to today, when it came out in 2018, and, you know, almost, well, it's not quite 10 years, but it's getting
Feels like it's
about,
been 10
about
years.
5.5 years down the road. The concept is still strong within American culture.
Yeah, and that was a really powerful story. And, you know, Jamie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on actually what is the process of developing an album from the initial source of inspiration and influences, and then how do you build a story around that? Because I feel like sometimes we get so overwhelmed by the different creative avenues we can go with putting out an album. And so how do you look at your story when you're developing new material? Do you start with, you know, influences, or do you start with liner notes? Do you start with different song ideas? How do you tell your story, and what's your process?
Yeah, well, just to step back, I feel like Dom is the shining example of when all of this goes so well and so organically with his musical interests, his actual background, and, you know, being aware and very tuned in to the larger kind of cultural streams, and staying the course for a long time. So one thing that I'm often, you know, I will just say, for a lot of artists, doing this after the fact is more difficult, more awkward, and usually less resonant. So I feel like the most resonant happens if these larger concepts that become what happens in the world of publicity, and even in the world of where you book yourself and how you're making strategic partnerships, if all of that is born out of the kind of deeper musical or cultural interest that you have, everything just works amazingly well and is very natural. And suddenly it's not like trying to fit an artistic vision into a business plan, or into marketing, or into social media content, or into all these things. And then people kind of bristle at the thought of having to convert all of this sort of aesthetic and artistic impulse into all of these languages that feel very foreign to that process. So just philosophically and practically, I feel like that is just so important, and Dom does it really well. And that's what I have always aspired to do, is to just take things that I'm fascinated with and turn them into projects. And really, projects being records or tours or collaborations are a way to actually explore things really deeply, because it takes a number of years to really get involved in a scene or community or do a lot of research. Some people will go do a PhD, and I just would make records. And hopefully you can figure out how to get paid for actually just investigating the things that are fascinating to you. So, a big early project for me was called Africa to Appalachia. And I had been listening to West African music before I even started playing the banjo. And then when I heard, probably in the, I don't know, something like 2005 or so, people talking about the African American and African roots of the banjo specifically, I just kept looking around going, why is nobody playing African music? People were saying, well, here's the first, white adaptation of African American styles, etc. And I was like, cool, but like, how come no one's playing African music? That music's amazing. I already loved it. And so I had the opportunity to meet a kora player from Mali. Long story short, we really connected. I got a grant from the Ontario Arts Council to go spend 3 months in Mali, making field recordings, doing research, studying, playing with people, traveling around, and came back and made a record called Africa to Appalachia. And, that kind of came at a time where that was really just starting to be in the air. So it was like, again, a tangible project. The Carolina Chocolate Drops, that's when we first met Dom, were really starting to tour and kind of bring this awareness to light. Maybe a year later, Bela Fleck made a record of his travels through East and West Africa. And so it's one of these things where, you also wind up just coming up with a piece of art at a time where it may or may not have a larger resonance. And we know lots of stories of people from the past and the present, who are making incredible work that people won't understand for a decade or two or more. And so that's also just one of the things that happens. So anyway, that gave me a real taste of all of the synergy of those things coming together, and we got a lot of press, etc. And then I realized that I had so many other fascinations. So every other project became similarly a way to really focus on a particular thing. I made a couple records centered around field recordings that Alan Lomax and his dad, John Lomax, and later other folklorists collected. And because I had all of these other experiences, I was able early on to, connect with the Library of Congress and collect with the, Association for Cultural Equity, which is the archival association for Alan Lomax's work. And then lots of other musicians who were collaborators on the project, who, had a relationship with field recordings and with making new things from old songs. And then I just kind of kept escalating like the process. I brought in a photographer who takes incredible analog black and white photos to the Library of Congress for a couple of days. And we sort of photographed all of this material and actual like photographing the acetate disc cutters, and all of that became part of the liner notes. So I would say, it really happens from the idea first, and then through the music collaborations, and then hopefully if all of those things go well, you can just bring all of that to the storyline, to the publicity, to the marketing, and it will feel as natural as possible and not a retrofit.
Yeah, I'm glad you broke it down that way, because when I first started working with Dom, I was honestly very clueless about the entire process of making records and sharing your story, because I have a political background, and it's a separate version of storytelling. And the one thing I think I learned the most from Dom and just working with other creatives in the field is that when you're making music, you almost have to think of it in like different sections of storytelling. And that's not just the music and the lyrics and the instruments you're playing, that's its own story through the songs and the styles. But then there's the actual visual elements too. How are you connecting the visuals to the audio? And that is almost just as important as the music in and of itself. And then there's the writing aspect too, and that's its own layer. And one of the biggest challenges that Dom and I had was, okay, we have all of this history, we have all these beautiful images, and then we have the music. How are we supposed to put this into like, a package that is going to be easily digestible for everybody? And then there's the other layers of publicity, which Jill, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about, which would be like the social media campaign. Like once you have the liner notes done and the album and the music and you're on the road and you have your story laid out, how do you send that to a wider audience? And what is the most effective way to get out the message?
When I bring somebody on for an album campaign, I ask them for the songs, the artwork, their photo, their bios, and I also ask them for song descriptions. They could be this long, they could be a mile long, they could be 9 pages long, but as long as I could have like some sort of like background to send to the reviewers and the media people, there's going to be a story involved with one of those songs. It's going to pop out and give a little boost to the review, and they would understand the back end. It could be a history. It could be, like Jason Ringenberg wrote a song about the National Freedom Riders and the college kids all involved. And that was a great big, talking point. Let me try and put my head back on the question. The way I try to use that in their bio, and I try to sort of springboard it towards a really cool idea. Publicity, they kind of just want the who, where, what, and then they want all the filler. Now, if you got a really great filler, and let's say you spent some time, on the trains instead of riding the trains, or you spent some time, teaching school or something, that's one thing. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I ask them to bring in their bios and their backstories and their lyrics, and I will go and dig and find some really cool stories to punch out there. For social media, you got to sort of keep it short and shorter. I did a 14-day countdown to Devin Allman's album years ago, and it was a lot of fun. And each day we did a little film, a little talk, a little film, a little talk. Then I hope I'm answering your question. I'm trying to bring me back in again.
You're definitely answering the question. And I think too, the main thing I want to know is like, when you're dealing with an artist, let's say I come to you and I say, hey, I have an album, hey, I have a concert, I need help promoting it. Do you only want the materials, the bio, the press kit, all of that, and then you take over and you do the pitching? Or is it more of a collaboration between you and the artist, where the artist actually helps to craft the story and then they deliver the story to you, and then it's your job to match the story with outlets? Or is it a combination of both, essentially?
It's a combination of both. I always try to make sure that when I'm writing a press release or writing a bio, that artist is comfortable with it and they're ready and they feel comfortable with it. They're ready to tell their story. And I always make sure that they have a hand in it. And, sometimes it dawns on them. They're like, oh, I forgot about that. And it just it makes their brains go, wow. And then I take it and then we punt it down the field and we start talking to all these different kinds of people. And I do talk differently to different outlets, like if I'm talking to radio or if I'm talking to, media or TV or whatever, I do cater my pitches to them. Because you can't, if I went to WSM and I said, this great artist and I don't, they're like, well, okay, but this doesn't seem to fit. This is radio, Jill, not TV. Oh, okay. You got to know your format.
Right.
That's what I always try to do.
So it seems like the common thread is when you're telling your story, there's a huge amount of research involved on both ends, right? From like the press side, you have to do your research on the artist and on the songs and on the materials, the creative materials. And then within that, you have to take some time to reflect and sort of digest it and then make those connections so that you're putting their story sort of in the right place at the right time. And,
Right.
Jamie, I think you brought up some great points with just talking about sort of like the overall way that you view the album making process as well, and how much research that takes for you too, because it's not enough to just have an idea, have your story, but then it's like, okay, who's going to fund it? How are you going to springboard it? What's the timeline look like? And those are some of the smaller or bigger logistics that kind of goes into it. And then I think for Dom, the takeaway from Dom is, when you put your story out there, you don't know who's going to breathe new life into it. Maybe you put Black Cowboys out and it has a 6-month run of great press. And then boom, next thing you know, all these big superstars want to sort of pick up on that story and make it more relevant or more popular. So I think there's so many ways that you can go about it, and keeping up with sort of the evolution of your story is very important too. It's not enough to just say it's out there, but how is it going into the future? Sorry,
Yeah,
James, you say
no,
something?
it's great. You bring up a good point, which is you also just never know how it's going to land. And you also never quite know where the energy is. So I think it's also really important to just step out of your own perspective and, your own design on, like we want to have a lot of control in the artistic process, but then when it comes to that interface with the world through publicity and all of these things, it really helps in a way to have an outside eye. So I write artist bios for people, and what I usually do is I have an hour-long conversation, and I ask very unusual questions and actually try to get people, and I do it on the phone, not on Zoom, on purpose, so that like we can be in a kind of eyes closed, dreaming, almost like, being on the psychoanalytic couch. And I try and get people into a little bit more of a like trancy state where they're talking very unselfconsciously, because a lot of times when people write their own bios, is they're editing themselves as they go, and they're continually trying to see themselves from the outside. And so I really just try and get people freewheeling, as much as possible. And I take copious notes. I write down almost everything they say. And then I go through and I find like what was the most unusual. And it might not be the thing that they thought was super important in their bio. And it's also really important to leave things out.
Yeah.
People also get really fastidious about, well, this has to be factually exactly accurate. And we forgot the third band that I was in high school. And,
Yeah.
mostly we
Yeah.
don't need biographical information. We don't care who you shared the stage with. We don't care who you studied with, etc. It's like really like and it's actually oftentimes about good storytelling. It's more about literature and seeing, and it's hard for people to see their own life
Mhm.
as being like a little novella, or seeing their record, as being a really fascinating piece of nonfiction. And
Yeah.
and so I end up actually sometimes even having to like advocate back for where things got interesting, and like, oh, well, I never would have focused on that, but actually it's really cool. And people often have to sit with it for a few days, to see. And it's a fascinating process. And it really helps to get, I think, an outside ear and an outside eye,
Yeah.
because we often can't see ourselves clearly.
Yeah, I would add to that saying like I just had a thought in my head. But I actually I worked with a very well-known bluegrass guy, and we got a professional writer, and we read it and we're like, "Oh, okay." So we ended up going back and kind of tweaking. You're like, "Oh." And then, going back to different stories. I worked with this band called the Royal Southern Brotherhood, and it was Devin Allman, Mike Zito, Cyril Neville, Jan Rico Scott, and Charlie Wooten, all different peoples, great players from all different worlds. And they did a album. It was called Don't Look Back. And the title was, since Cyril Neville was on Dave Grohl's Sonic Highways, I said, Royal Southern Brotherhood takes the sonic highway to Muscle Shoals and doesn't look back. So, sometimes I can put it in a little bow. And then sometimes I can, I've used words like razzle dazzle, and I've used very serious words, and I try to think like a billboard. And if you're driving along, you're looking for, clean bathrooms, coffee, and gas. You don't want to have to keep reading. And then what exit was it? 2? And so I really try to keep it simple. And yeah, I agree. And you always have to have someone else look at it. I've had 8 people look at one bio, and there was like 2 mistakes, and it went out. And I was like, 8 people looked at it. It's still So yeah.
Right. Well, and you all brought up a great point too. And I think at one point, Jamie, you mentioned there are certain things you might not want to include in a bio. And I kind of want to ask Dom a little bit about this question in conjunction with that comment, which is, how do you promote your story and still be authentic, but not give everyone personal things that you don't want to necessarily share? And Dom recently put out an album, Traveling Wildfire, which was a very personal deep dive into some of the struggles that he's had. And so, but one of the concerns that we had when we were working on the album was, what should we not share? Like, should we go into some of the deeper, darker sides of what has happened throughout your life, or should we sort of make it into more of a holistic view of your life during the different challenging moments? So I want to ask you about how you sort of toe the line between being personal and authentic, but not giving away too much. And then I'd love to hear from Jamie and Jill about what do you think is appropriate to leave out of a bio?
Well, a lot of the writing that I do in my albums, it's sort of an outgrowth of 2 things. One part is I love, historical reissues, obviously, of different music, because you have to recontextualize the way that the music has been presented, and there's a lot of different labels. I can think of Yazoo Records, or even Rounder Records, or Rhino Music, or places like that, where they've had to completely recontextualize a series of music so that the audience can understand the music outside of its original context. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect has to do with one of the things that I found when I first started into performing. When I first saw Dave Van Ronk, actually when I was 18, I found that one of the things that was brilliant about what Van Ronk would do in his storytelling is that he would combine historical anecdotes, but personal stories, and then stories about the artist. And it was sort of a free-flowing type of narrative, not necessarily stream of conscious, because what you can go stream of consciousness, but as a folk singer, usually you want to connect some type of story to the song that you're singing, so that the song itself becomes more powerful. And what I ended up doing over the years, because I found I was playing in a lot of different places, one of the things that could be very powerful was I started to build the number of stories I had around different songs. So all of a sudden, when I'm performing in a live setting, this is a way of telling your story in a live setting, having 4 or 5 different stories that you can tell to any given song that you might sing. This allows you to be able to, one, give a little bit of information about you that sometimes is a bit more abstract, because for me, I don't like to tell a whole bunch about myself necessarily on stage, but through the stories that I've collected and the stories I choose to tell in any given night, I feel like collectively all together it tells a little bit of something about my interests. And also being able to have that multitude of stories, you're able to you're not getting bored with the stories you're telling, because that's another thing too. I learned this when I was busking on the streets. You can have an excellent piece of music being played, but the audience has to be interested. And if you keep that part of, because the audience is a wild card. The audience isn't necessarily thinking of I don't want to say they're not thinking of quality, but they sometimes the audience is looking for intriguing aspects to a piece of music or a performance, and that can be different for everybody. And so when you have
Yeah.
stories, you can sort of you can sort of start thinking about the stories that you're telling as a point of intrigue so that people can be drawn into it in one way. You know, we've been talking about writing, and of course writing is difficult in a way because you have a tangible written statement that you have to get as much mileage out of as you can. So it has to be interesting, but you also want to be able to stand behind it 10 years, 20 years down the road so that you're saying something that feels truthful and authentic to yourself. But I mean, for me, when it comes to a personal statement, yeah, you got to be able to reach deep into yourself and make sure that you find what you're trying to get out of whatever you're presenting on stage. Hopefully
No, that totally does. And I had like all these little like light bulbs going off when you were talking because, I thought about it when you were saying being on stage and telling your story. There's so many ways that you can tell the same story, right? And that's the one thing I've seen you do a lot. And sometimes I'm like, wait a second, you're presenting this story in a different way with, different elements to it. And I just thought that was really interesting. And especially when you think about like albums or articles, like there's ways that you have to like revamp your story or revamp your bio to maybe give a little bit more details, a little bit more intrigue, or maybe certain outlets just want a very quick, simple story and other ones want a larger narrative. And so just sort of thinking about that holistically is very important, especially when you're writing your bio or standing on stage. You sort of have to gauge the interest, gauge the audience, and then you can know how to truly tell your story, whether you want to give them the whole thing from beginning to end or just the cliff notes.
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple of things that come to me about all this. And when Merle Haggard was in jail, he talked to Johnny Cash and he goes, "Hey, how do I do this?" He goes, "Tell the truth." And then there's a certain songwriter who did jail time, and if you bring it up, he'll hang up. He'll hang up. He used to hang up on people, but if he brought it up, it was okay. So sometimes you have to, and there's no more mystique about the rock and roll and the traveling Wilburys or whatever you want to call, travel troubadours. There's no more. It's because it's all social media and the internet. So it kind of leaves, you have to really be precious or be careful about what you want to put in there. You don't want to say, well, I went to prison or I went to the hospital. But sometimes you can have things birth out of you. Your art form can be that part. And if that's a part of your story and you're okay with that, I know people who are scared to put out their bio right now because they were wrongfully accused of something. And they are like, do I do this? And I said, how's this going to damage me? And I said, well, it's been 10 years. So, but yeah, it can be brought out and brought in, but I hear you. It is a delicate balance, but those are things that you can reveal during interviews or you can reveal during the live show. I've heard Ramblin' Jack talk. I've heard, William Bell talk. I've heard, and they never have the same intro for anything. You can kind of hear bits and pieces, but it's I think being authentic should be the most easiest thing to do. And if you need to cover up, then maybe there's something you need to work on your inner self. I don't know.
And
Yeah.
I would say there's no rules around this. Like Bob Dylan is a shining example of someone who very creatively evaded. Oh, am I not muted? Okay. Yeah, Dylan kind of evaded questions and refused to participate
Yeah,
in this whole like tell-all
yeah,
kind of culture. Even as early as like 1962,
yeah,
he was already doing that and just resisting this kind of tabloid approach to celebrities that I think has really become normalized through social media content. And on the other side, if you are comfortable with it at a certain time, it can be, really profound honesty can be really, really, really powerful. I recently wrote a bio for someone who actually wanted to talk all about her divorce, which might not have been interesting on the face of it, but she actually went to see a Jungian therapist and did all of this work with archetypes and ended up using that in her songwriting, where she kind of like, had a much bigger view of these things that happened to her that were challenging. And I think I would say like the width of her perspective and the things that she brought into the conversation around it actually made it like a really fascinating story. And she was open to talking about it. And so I made her bio all about that. And it was like pretty edgy. And she was super happy with it. And I had recently worked with someone else who wasn't sure whether he wanted to talk about coming out as queer in relation to this record that he had made. And the more we talked about it, the more actually the themes of the record were so much an expression of his own process of coming out. Um,
Mhm.
and I had no, you know, I really didn't push him either way. I was just like, think about whether or not this is something that feels important for you. And he came back and he was like, yeah, definitely, let's do it. And a week later, he called me and he said, I read the bio and I was so moved, and I'd never kind of like put all these pieces together. Um, and we ended up working together for a few sessions where I helped him write all of his stage banter, um, to tie together his story personally and what the theme of the record, which was about, through the way that he kind of set up the songs. And it was really fascinating and kind of an unexpected outgrowth of this bio writing process that was really cool. So you kind of never know where these things will go. As I said earlier, always kind of tried to put the spotlight away from my personal story onto the music that I was interested in. And then about 6 years ago, my brother died very suddenly. And I ended up writing a record about my relationship with him, some of his shadow, some of the shadow in our relationship, and just about my grieving process. And it was incredibly personal and totally unlike anything I had ever done. And it was really, really, really gratifying and really, really different. So we can also go through phases with our relationship to how our own life impacts the art that we make and how much of that is on the surface.
Right. And then when I'm going to piggyback real quick on what he said about the celebrity, and everybody wants to think, oh, well, Dom likes cornflakes. I like cornflakes, or someone likes Diet Coke, or so, oh, I have the same coffee maker. Ooh, so it's just that relatability, and everybody relates on something different. And you can I always say be yourself. And if I pull up something you don't want to say, we don't have to say it, like exes, or a time where you were struggling really hard or whatever. But you have to be relatable, and that's why I think a lot of health problems that come up with people help. A lot of political stances help. A lot of traveling helps. I have a guy I'm working with right now, Noel McKay. He bought a house in Spain, and everybody wants to know what he's doing on it. So yeah, it's all about being related, and you never know who you're going to reach out to until they come up to you and tell you at a show and go, wow.
Absolutely. And so, for listeners out there, it's really important to, just know that whenever you're ready to tell your story, folks are ready to listen. And we have some wonderful folks that will help you curate your story and your image. And then also, if there's anything that you aren't ready to share, don't feel like you're obligated to put it out there. And you can protect your own identity and your own story. And there's nothing wrong with that. You are still being authentic, but you have to also be comfortable with what you're sharing. And so on that note, I know we only have 10 minutes, but I'm sure we're willing to stay a few extra minutes for Q&A. But if anyone in the live streaming universe wants to drop some questions for our panel, I will be checking them right now. So I'll give folks a couple seconds to send over some questions. Okay, so it looks like, oh, Jamie, that was you.
Oh, yeah,
I
we
thought that
got
was a question. I was like, wait, okay, let me.
Yeah, got a little bit of a link here for Jamie for some of his bio writing.
Yes. Okay, well, let's see, Miss Alexa. How do you know what the most interesting part is? Okay, yeah. What's the most interesting part?
Ooh.
Dom, what do you have a quick response to that one?
Well, it again. It's a thing where you have to think in two ways. What's most interesting to you personally? That's one part of it, because if you can't convince yourself, you're not going to convince anybody else. So that's one aspect. And then on the other end, you can you can think about the audience ahead of time, sort of like Jill mentioned about radio and television. You can kind of get a sense like where the receptors are going to go and the people that are going to receive the message. You can kind of anticipate that. And there are ways that, especially as you go along, you can really start to figure that out. Like with Black Cowboys, to me, the three main characters I ended up talking about as specific people besides the concept were Bill Pickett, the rodeo rider, Nat Love, who was one of the few black cowboys to write his own autobiography, and then Bass Reeves, who was said to be the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. But then there were other people like Stagecoach Mary Fields, and which brought the story into talking about black women of the Old West, the Buffalo Soldiers, Pullman Porters. So these were sort of things I knew would be areas of intrigue for people. So you can sort of think about it like that, and that can allow you to get interesting material. And you can kind of whittle it down, write a list out, and then say, hey, this works, this doesn't work, this is interesting, and you can be as brutal as you want to be because you're the one that's the messenger.
Absolutely. And then also to piggyback off of that, I'd say the most interesting part is whatever people respond to, right? So you also have to like pay attention to the reactions that you're getting from family, friends, or the media when you're putting things out there. So you also have to do a lot of testing, a lot of research, and just gather as much information. And then also have the confidence that, it is interesting because you like it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying that either. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, let me go to the next question. Let's see. Okay, someone's asking about the difference between pitching for different media outlets. So yeah, could we help her out with just kind of giving a little play-by-play of pitching to media? So once you get the press kit and the bio, Jill, how do you start pitching? Do you come up with a list of media outlets and then do you email them the whole story in the press package, or do you wait until they respond and then you start to follow up with them?
Basically, what I do is I get on board with the client and we write the press release, get everything ready, make sure even his websites are ready, make sure his social medias are ready. So they all look like one big nice package, like, a Coca-Cola bottle or something.
Mhm.
And I basically send out a blast and, they come back. Oh, I like this person. Oh, I like it. Can you send me the CD? Oh, can't wait. And then I come back, a week or so later, and I play a fancy game of follow up for the next 2 months. And so we start linking things. But when I'm talking to a radio person, I got to think they have so much time, so much time, so much time. And then with TV, they got to be there on location. And then with like newspapers and magazines, it can be anywhere on the road. It could be anywhere. And you just have to know who you're talking to. Radio, like I said, like with folk radio, there's a lot of specialty shows. Same thing with blues radio, and they don't have a whole lot of time. And then with magazines like Vintage Guitar, they're so far out. Like they'll be releasing January and like November, so you could get an article in there, it won't show up for another 6 months. And then the same thing with Living Blues. You could it could be a year. I mean, it was almost a year for William Bell's cover story because it started with the album and it kind of percolated and came all the way around. So I always tell people you might not get it right away, and it could come residually, it could come later. And then also I go back and I pick up things like I was talking to a client, and I did one with David Olney, and he went back and he was asked to dissect his favorite Towns Van Zandt song, which was Pancho and Lefty. So he wrote that and got paid for it. I mean, there's different little avenues. Like, Dom could write for something like a newspaper, an article, or an expo, like a editorial or whatever, or feature, and get paid for that. And those are things I also look for because I know it's rough out there for you you know,
Mhm.
with
Yeah.
and everything.
Right,
That's a
But
great,
yeah,
that,
and, you know, there's always ways to do it. I even almost got Devin Allman on Rachel Ray because of his hot sauce. But
that's a great point, actually. I think
yeah,
anytime you can kind of look outside the music ecosystem, the better. I mean, in all aspects, you
yeah,
know, I I produced a record recently, and there was a song about someone's father who had Alzheimer's. And so we ended up reaching out to Alzheimer's podcasts
mhm,
and, got some press in that direction, and a bunch of things happened because of that. So finding, ways that you can, because everybody's going to be pitching No Depression.
yeah,
It's going to be the most competitive piece of press if you're a songwriter,
right,
which is great, and you should try for that. But if you go somewhere else, suddenly you're going to be more interesting and more unique in that
mhm,
particular world. Even if they don't usually cover music, that can be totally great. And I would say the same thing is true of playing gigs,
mhm,
and Dom's been a great example of this. I've done a lot of this, is looking outside of the same places that everybody's playing. Again, New York City, everybody wants to play at Joe's Pub, but maybe you go play at a museum, maybe you go play at a place that doesn't usually have music, but they have an
library,
audience. And there's something about your story or your project that makes it a fit.
right,
And I think that is true more than ever, as things in the music ecosystem get more threadbare.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and
Well,
because I found that with Western museums, that was something I hadn't anticipated with Black Cowboys, like places that don't usually have music. All of a sudden, Western museums started showing up and wanting to fit me with a presentation of something, like whether it was Western art or something like that. So yeah, that happens all the time.
Mhm.
definitely. Well, I do have a couple of more questions if you all don't mind. I'd like to pivot over to another question. Chris Valillo, he's asking, I've had a full-length article written by a third party for a project I'm working on, and what are the best ways to use it? And so, just to give you a little background, Chris, he's putting together a really wonderful special concert dedicated to the history of Western Illinois and Forgotonia. And so he's actually building together a press kit. I'm helping him build that together, and he's got beautiful images and a press release, and he's pretty much all set. So the full length article is something he developed with someone else, and he would love to know how to use it. So do you all recommend that he puts it in the press kit, or should he use that article that he's already written to pitch to actual media outlets?
I think usually like a Christmas tree. You could basically you can take it. You should be able, you should put it in his press kit, like as his bio, as an add-on. And then I would totally use it as a calling card. Definitely. And if it's and I mean he should be pitching this to, like, the Illinois state, of tourism or whatever, commerce and all those places that love that kind of stuff, that they can pull in and put on their websites, put in their newsletters, put it in their social media things, and it can draw more eyes on you. But definitely keep it in your back pocket. Definitely.
Okay, wonderful. Chris, I hope that answers your question. And then also, someone else, Diane Perry, she's asking, okay, some of you seem to have a laser focus on a certain type of music, even Jamie, although the laser focus sounds like it changes from project to project. So the question is, what about having a lot of different styles of music alchemy? Is there a way to turn that into a compelling story? Or how do you know when the story is compelling? I feel so close to my own self and have little perspective. And I think, Jamie, if you want to answer that, but Dom also, he sort of, I feel like, falls under that category of having a lot of different styles and how to make that into a compelling story, too.
Yeah. I mean, I would have to know, I wish we had time. I would actually ask a lot of questions, and you can ask yourself those questions, or find someone that has some outside perspective. Um, but really, it's one of those things like, I'll give you a kind of songwriting analogy, which is that, usually people don't just write, the three verses that wind up being in the song. You know, Leonard Cohen famously wrote 100 verses for Hallelujah. He spent like 2 years and wrote verse after verse after verse after verse, trying all kinds of things, and then he picked the five best ones, right? And so we never do it for the first time. And then suddenly, when we're writing our bio, you know, we try our bio, we have an idea, we write it, and then we go, okay, we're done. We might edit it and do some line editing, etc. But I would say you could actually write several different bios and see which one works the best. You know, again, like Pat Pattison, the songwriting teacher at Berkeley, talks about writing a song in the first and the third person. Do it both ways. See which one actually hits more, you know? And so I do a lot of that when I'm writing people's bios is I actually will try out, you know, 10 different first sentences or 10 different approaches to the first paragraph. And maybe I've got a really good story angle that I think is going to lead the way. And then after a while, I think, you know what? I think I've got something that feels stronger. One of them's not better or more accurate. It just feels like it takes you into the story better at the beginning. And I might move things around and shuffle things around. And so I would encourage you to, you know, write things a bunch of different ways and try it where you focus on the music. Try it where you focus on, you know, the stories of the songs. Try it when you focus on something else and see which one hits. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You can feel you got to play with it a little bit. And I've played with
Hmm.
a lot of really big people's bios, and I said, you know, this is kind of scattered. Let's pull this all together and streamline it. And
Yeah.
it's very hard to write the big bio, the little bio, the mini bio, the micro bio. And if you got a huge genre, I mean, I work with a lot of genres: blues, punk, well, pop, rock, you know, all of it. But my strong suits are Americana, blues, roots music, folk, and you know all that. I've been working with Americana before it was Americana; it was alt country. That's how it's been. I worked with Billy Joe Shaver, and he was a talking legend. Didn't he walk the talk, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, he spoke very clearly of himself. He knew exactly where he came from. So if you know who you are, you're not cocky about it, you're not confident about it, and you can be confident about it. That's where it shines through.
Hmm. I have one other quick tip is um, I don't love the short, medium, long bio. I find them kind of annoying to keep rewriting all these different size pieces. So what I usually do is I write each paragraph to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and focus on one aspect. Like you might have a whole paragraph just about the songs on a record and the stories behind them. You might have a paragraph that really focuses more on your, you know, critical acclaim in places you've played, etc., or more on your teaching, or more whatever it is. And I try and use them modularly so that your long bio is all of them. The first paragraph can stand on its own and be the thing you'd put in a festival program, or be just the one paragraph pitch in an email to a journalist. And then you could use the first and last if you want, you know, the primary story and some accolades. Or if you're teaching a workshop, you know, you use the one about your educational background and stuff. And then you don't have a bunch of different, you have one bio and you just use different pieces of it. I find that to be much simpler.
Absolutely. That's actually super helpful because I love having different types of bios too. So to know that you should really sort of focus on one, I think that's very important. And so, you know, it's sort of the end of our panel now. Let me see if there's any other questions. Yeah, it feels like this was an amazing conversation, and you all had so many awesome talking points. And if anyone's interested in connecting with Jill Kettles, Jamie Stone, or my husband, Don Clemens, feel free to reach out. Everyone's working on amazing projects and helping other artists, so I'm sure you all could really benefit from their services as well. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for joining Virtual Connections through Farm. And I'll pass it over to Charlie and see if there's anything else he wants to mention. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation in our panel today. Dom, Jill, Jamie, and Vania. Wonderful, wonderful. Very good information. I just wanted to take a moment to remind everybody that this coming Thursday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, we have our virtual performance lane, and that goes on right here in this Zoom room. So check back with our website at thefarmfolk.org in the virtual connections section for ways to register for that if you're not already registered. And then also keep your eyes out. We will have a special edition Folk Plus performance lane coming very soon. So we want to let people know about that. Plus, just checking as an FAI board member, Folk Plus is coming. Keep an eye out for all that and do register. It's very affordable. Assuming you have some sort of device, a digital device. Anyway, thank you, Annie Capps, for doing all the work in the background. She's keeping us going. Thank you, Alexa Dawson, for all your work, and all of the farm board directors, and all of you for coming out this afternoon and this morning for those of you in the Far East or wherever you may be. Good to
Far
see
West.
you, Sue. Far West. Yes.
That way.
That way. Depends which way you're flying, I guess.
Thanks, Charlie.
Anyway,
And
thank
also
you.
shout out to Alexa for helping to organize this panel. Alexa Dawson, woohoo, forum board member. And you guys were all amazing. This was incredible. Thank you very, very much.
We could have talked for hours. Thanks.
I know that we may need to do it again. All right, signing off now. Bye, everyone.